Hello, everybody, and we're going to go back live now and listen to Michael Cohen answer questions from the Congress.
Become a member of one of the golf clubs, and I also don't have anybody that was interested in that. And it got to the point where it was down to the wire. It was either somebody wire the funds and purchase the life rights to the story from Miss Clifford, or it was going to end up being sold to television, and that would have embarrassed the president and it would have interfered with the election.
But the president has never amended his 2017 form to this day, and while you're facing the consequences of going to jail, he is not.
Well, I believe that they amended a financial disclosure form, and there's a footnote somewhere buried. I don't recall specifically what it says, but there is a footnote buried somewhere.
Can you describe, Michael, to the American people, catch and kill?
So catch and kill is a method that exists when you're working with a news outlet. In this specific case, it was AMI, National Enquirer, David Pecker, Dylan Howard, and others, where they would contact me or Mr. Trump or someone and state that there's a story that's percolating out there that you may be interested in. And then what you do is you contact that individual and you purchase the rights to that story from them.
And you practice this for the president?
I was involved in several of these catch and kill episodes, but these catch and kill scenarios existed between David Pecker and Mr. Trump long before I started working for him in 2007.
Michael, can you suggest who else this committee should talk to for additional information on this or anything else?
Yes, I believe David Pecker, Dylan Howard, Barry Levine of AMI as well, Alan Weisselberg, Alan Garten of the Trump Organization as well.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony, and Mr. Chairman, this is a story of redemption.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Comer.
Mr. Cohen, in your testimony, you stated that you began work for the Trump Organization as a lawyer dealing with real estate transactions. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Prior to coming to Congress, I served as a director of two different banks, so I've seen hundreds of loan applications. And to try to determine your credibility here today, I just wanted to ask you a couple of real estate transaction questions just to see how, in fact, you operate. According to the Southern District of New York prosecutors, you lied to banks to secure loans by falsely stating the amount of debt you were carrying. Mr. Cohen, my question to you, was it Donald Trump's fault that you knowingly committed a crime of deception to defraud a bank?
No, it's not.
Was that fraudulent loan you obtained for the Trump Organization or for you personally?
It would be for me, though I'm not familiar with which loan that you're referring to. I would like to say one thing,
Mr.
sir.
Cohen,
Sorry, I would like just to respond. When we're talking about the home equity line of credit, which is what I believe you're referring to.
We're also referring. I'm going to ask a question pertaining to your summer home that you purchased.
I never purchased a summer home. No individual or no bank in the 22 years that I've had loans have ever lost a dollar with me. I owe no money to any bank.
Well, the banks usually find out if someone's trying to deceive them.
In 22 years, I have no money that's ever been owed to any individual or any bank.
Mr. Cohen, did your so-called blind loyalty to the president cause you to defraud the bank for your own personal gain?
Sir, I take exception to that because there's never been a fraud I never defrauded any bank.
Well, let's dig a little deeper on that, on the bank fraud. According to the Southern District of New York, you failed to disclose more than $20 million in liabilities, as well as tens of thousands of dollars of monthly expenses. That's according to the Southern District of New York. Now, Mr. Cohen, you being a lawyer, surely you knew you were breaking the law. No, why would you have done that?
Sir, I'm not a CPA, and I pled guilty. I'm going to prison as a result of it.
Because you're a con?
No, sir.
Okay.
Because I pled guilty, and I am going to be doing the time. I have caused tremendous pain to my family, and I take
Let's go back to the one last question about the bank. When the bank found out about the liabilities that you failed to disclose, you lied again to the bank. This is according to the Southern District of New York, and said it had been expunged when in fact you just shifted the debt to another bank. So apparently, according to the information that we received, your intent to defraud the bank was for the desire to purchase the summer home for $8.5 million?
No, sir. That would have been off of an equity line, considering I had less than a 50% loan to value on the assets, and there was a pre-existing line of credit that existed years before the date that you're referring to, where this is all surrounding New York City taxi medallions.
But you understand that when you fail to disclose liabilities, especially $20 million in liabilities, that is, in fact, fraud.
Except even with the $20 million in liability.
How much was it?
The medallions were at that time worth over $45 million.
Mr. Cohen, you called Donald Trump a cheat in your opening testimony. What would you call yourself?
A fool.
You calling... Okay, well, no comment on that.
I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, we said we were in search of the truth. I don't believe that Michael Cohen is capable of telling the truth. And I would hope that as this committee moves forward, that when we have the opportunity to subpoena witnesses, we subpoena witnesses that are not recently disbarred, are not convicted felon, and witnesses that haven't committed bank fraud and tax fraud. That is how we're going to determine the truth. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time to the ranking.
That was Congressman
I think, gentlemen,
Comer.
I would just make one point. We just had a
Weak question, in my
5-minute debate
opinion.
where Mr. Cohen disputes what the Southern District of New York found, what the judge found, that he was actually guilty of committing bank fraud. If this statement back here doesn't say it all, Cohen's consciousness
This
of
is
wrongdoing
Ohio
is fleeting,
Congressman
his
Jim
remorse is
Jordan.
minimal, his instinct
He's
is to
pretty
blame
good.
others.
Sorry.
To blame others is strong. There's only one wrong with that statement. His remorse is non-existent. He just debated a member of Congress saying, I really didn't do anything wrong with the false bank things that I'm guilty of and going to prison for.
Mr. Jordan, that's not what I said, and you know that that's not what I said. I said I pled guilty, and I take responsibility for my actions. Shame on you, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman,
Not what I said. Shame on you.
Mr. Chairman,
That's not what I said. What I said is I took responsibility, and I take responsibility. What I was doing is explaining to the gentleman that his facts are inaccurate. I take responsibility for my mistakes. All right, I am remorseful, and I am going to prison. I will be away from my wife and family for years. So before you turn around and you cast more dispersion, please understand, there are people watching you today that know me a whole lot, but I made mistakes. I own them, and I didn't fight with the Southern District of New York. I didn't put the system through an entire scenario. But what I did do is I pled guilty, and I am going to be, again, going to prison.
Ms. Norton.
Mr. Cohen, at the center of the reasons you're going to prison is conviction for campaign finance violations, and they center around some salacious revelations. The Washington Post reported or aired a Access Hollywood video. It set a record for the number of people who watched crash the newspaper's server. But this happened in early October, on the cusp of the election. What was Mr. Trump's reaction to the video becoming public at that time, and was he concerned about the impact of that video on the election?
The answer is yes. As I stated before, I was in London at the time visiting my daughter who was studying there for a Washington semester abroad. And I received a phone call during the dinner from Hope Hicks stating that she had just spoken to Mr. Trump, and we need you to start making phone calls to the various different news outlets that you have relationships with. And we need to spin this. And what we want to do is just to claim that this was men locker room talk.
Was the concern about the election in particular?
The answer is yes. Then couple that with Karen McDougal, which then came out around the same time. And then on top of that, the Stormy Daniels matter.
Yeah, and these things happen in the month before the election and almost one after the other. The Stormy Daniels revelation, where prosecutors and officials, prosecutors learned of that matter, and prosecutors stated that the officials at the magazine contacted you about the story, and the magazine, of course, is the National Enquiry. Is that correct, that they did?
Yes, ma'am.
Come to you. Were you concerned about this news story becoming public right after the Access Hollywood study in terms of impact on the election?
I was concerned about it, but more importantly, Mr. Trump was concerned
That was
about
my
it.
next question. What was the president's concern about these matters becoming public in October as we were about to go into an election?
I don't think anybody would dispute this belief that after the wildfire that encompassed the Billy Bush tape, that a second follow-up to it would have been pleasant. And he was concerned with the effect that it had had on the campaign, on how women were seeing him, and ultimately whether or not he would have a shot in the general election.
And so you negotiated the $130,000 payment.
The $130,000 number was not a number that was actually negotiated. It was told to me by Keith Davidson that this is a number that Ms. Clifford wanted.
Well, you finally completed that deal, as it were, on October the 25th, days before the election. What happened in the interim?
Contemplated whether or not to do it. Wasn't sure if she was really going to go public. There was, again, some communications back and forth between myself and Keith Davidson. And ultimately it came to either do it or don't. At which time, again, I had gone into Mr. Trump's office, as I did after each and every conversation. And he had told me that he had spoken to a couple of friends, and it's $130,000. It's not a lot of money, and we should just do it. So go ahead and do it. And I was at the time with Alan Weisselberg, where he directed us to go back to Mr. Weisselberg's office and figure this all out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Beddoes.
Mr. Cohen, do you know Lynn Patton? I'm right here.
Oh, yes, sir.
Do you know Lynn Patton?
Yes, I do.
I asked Lynn to come today in her personal capacity to actually shed some light. How long have you known Ms. Patton?
I'm responsible for Lynn Patton joining the Trump Organization and the job that she currently holds.
Well, I'm glad you acknowledge that, because you made some very demeaning comments about the president that Ms. Patton doesn't agree with. In fact, it has to do with your claim of racism. She says that as a daughter of a man born in Birmingham, Alabama, that there is no way that she would work for an individual who was racist. How do you reconcile the two of those, Mr.
As neither should I, as the son of a Holocaust survivor.
But, Mr. Cohen, I guess what I'm saying is I've talked to the president over 300 times. I've not heard one time a racist